Hello, today I'm looking at Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 28, and this is entitled the Mahahatthipadopama Sutta, which is translated as the Greater Discourse on the Simile of the Elephant's Footprint. And it occurs at Jettas Park, and the sutta is delivered by the Venerable Sariputta. And he starts off, just as the footprint of any living creature that walks can be placed within an elephant's footprint, so too all wholesome states can be included in the Four Noble Truths. That is the noble truth of suffering, the noble truth of the origin of suffering, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, and the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Now, the Nanamoli Bodhi version of the translation uses the word suffering for dukkha. The Thanissaro translation uses the word stress. So it could be suffering, could be stress, could be discontent. So it's just general malaise, probably, would be a more neutral term. Sariputta then goes on saying, what is the noble truth of suffering? Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair are suffering. Not to obtain what one wants is suffering. In short, the five aggregates affected by clinging are suffering. And what are the five aggregates affected by clinging? A material form aggregate, a feeling aggregate, perception aggregate, formations aggregate, consciousness aggregate. Now the formations aggregate I've read elsewhere as being the mental formations, which may be a bit more logical. And the word aggregate is a translation of the Pali word kanda, which is also a heap or collection or group or piece or pieces. So the feeling group, the perception group, the mental formations group. And to continue, Sariputta carries on, and what is the material form aggregate? The four great elements and the material form derive from the four great elements. And what are the four great elements? And the four great elements are the earth element, the air element, the fire element, and the water element. And what is the earth element? It's either internal or external. And what is the internal earth element? Whatever internally belongs to the person. The hair, the teeth, the skin, flesh, sinew, bones, kidneys, heart, and so on and so forth. Now, both earth element and external earth element are simply earth element. And this should be seen as it actually is. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When it is seen this way, one becomes disenchanted with the earth element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the earth element. Sometimes, when the water element is disturbed, for example a flood, the external earth element vanishes. So, if even this great external earth element is seen to be impermanent, subject to destruction, disappearance and change, what of this body, which is clung to by craving, lasts but a short while? There can be no considering that as I, or mine, or I am. So then, if others abuse or harass a monk, he understands thus. A painful emotion coming from ear contact has arisen in me. That is dependent, not independent. Dependent on what? Dependent on contact. Then he sees that contact is impermanent. Perception is impermanent. Mental formations are impermanent. Consciousness is impermanent. Realizing this, the monk acquires confidence, steadiness and resolution. If others attack the monk with fists, knives and sticks, then as per the simile of the saw, which is Majjhima Nikaya number 21, Sutta number 21, where Buddha explained that even if evil people were to sever you limb by limb with a two-handed saw, he who gave rise to a mind of hate towards them would not be following my teaching. That's a quote from Buddha. Tireless energy should be aroused in me, unremitting mindfulness established. My body shall be tranquil and untroubled, my mind concentrated and unified. Let contact with fists, clods, sticks and knives assail this body. For this teaching of the Buddhas is being practiced by me. And just to pause at that point, the translations have Buddhas in the plural. So I assume this is referring to the Buddhas over the eons, but it's translated by Thanissaro, I think with a comma and capital B, but in the Pali Text Society Roman text version, it's Buddha with a small b. So, just as an aside, they're referring to over the course of all the Buddhas. The phrase in the Pali Text Society is Idan Buddhanang, not capitalised. Anyway, I'm going off the point a bit. It then goes on to talk about equanimity supported by the wholesome. And again, the phrases that are not used to. So equanimity is meaning the steady conscious realisation of reality's transience. So I'll repeat that slowly. The steady conscious realisation of reality's transience is equanimity. So all these things going on, verbally abused, hit with sticks, it's just transient. And wholesome states are goodwill, metta in Pali, compassion, karuna in Pali, altruistic joy, mudita in Pali, and equanimity, upekkha in Pali. So, talking about equanimity supported by the wholesome states. So, if equanimity supported by the wholesome does not become established in the monk, then the monk becomes anxious. And again, the translation here in the Bodhi version is in fact sense of urgency. But the word used in the Pali is samvega, which can be translated as anxious. From my understanding, it's easier to understand it as being in sort of an anxious state. And the sutta continues, it is a loss for me, no gain for me, bad for me, not good for me. In recollecting the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, equanimity supported by the wholesome does not become established. So it gives an example saying, Sariputta says, just like a daughter-in-law is anxious to please her father-in-law, so too when a monk recollects the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, if equanimity supported by the wholesome does not become established, the monk becomes anxious. However, if when he recollects the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, equanimity supported by the wholesome becomes established in him, then he is satisfied with it. At that point, much has been achieved by that monk. So again, just to reiterate, equanimity meaning the steady conscious realisation of reality's transience, and wholesome states being goodwill, compassion, altruistic joy and equanimity. So that's sort of gone through the earth element. It next goes on to the water element, again stating this may be internal or external. The internal element is bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, and so on. Both internal and external are simply the water element. So this is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. When one sees it thus with proper wisdom, one becomes disenchanted with the water element, and the mind is dispassionate towards the water element. There are times when the water element becomes disturbed. It carries away villages, towns, cities and countries. Great oceans sink down hundreds of leagues. Water in the great oceans can stand many fathoms deep or just ankle deep. When this water element is seen to be impermanent, subject to destruction, impermanence and change, what of the body, which is clung to by craving and lasts but a short while? There can be no considering this as I or mine or I am. The sutta then repeats as before with regards to a monk being harassed or beaten. The monk who has seen the water element for what it actually is, if he recollects the Buddha, Dhamma, Sangha, equanimity supported by the wholesome becomes established in him, then he is satisfied with it. At this point, much has been achieved or done by the monk. Next goes on to the fire element. What is it? Internal and external. Internal, that by which one is warmed, aged, and consumed that which is eaten, drunk. Both internal and external should be seen as it actually is with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. Seen this way, one becomes disenchanted with the fire element and makes the mind dispassionate towards the fire element. The fire element can burn up villages, towns and so on and so forth, and only goes out due to lack of fuel. When this external fire element is seen to be impermanent, then what of the body? What of this body which is clung to by craving and lasts but a while? There can be no considering that as I, mine, or I am. So he repeats the talk about the verbal physical harm to the monk, and if he sees the fire element for what it is, and if he recollects the Buddha, Dhamma and Sangha, equanimity supported by the wholesome becomes established in him. Then he is satisfied with it. At this point, much has been done by the monk. It then goes on to the ear element, internal and external. Internal, wind of the belly, in the bowel, in breath, out breath. Both internal and external air elements are simply air elements, and seen with proper wisdom. This is not mine, this I am not, this is not myself. And seen thus, the mind is dispassionate towards the air element. The external air element can sweep away villages, towns, etc. But during the hot season, there is no wind. When seen as being impermanent, subject to disappearance, destruction and change, what of this body which is clung to by craving and lasts but a short while? There can be no considering that as I, mine or I am. Then goes on to repeat the talk about the verbal and physical abuse to the monk. And he summarised by saying, so friends, just as when a space is enclosed by timber and other materials, it comes to be termed house, so too, when a space is enclosed by bones, sinews, flesh and skin, it comes to be termed material form. The sutta then sort of changes focus slightly and talks about the aggregates. So it begins with, Sariputta begins with, if a sighted person has nothing to see, then there is no stimulus to the corresponding section of consciousness. If the sighted person and external forms come into range, but there is no engagement, then there again is no stimulus to the corresponding section of consciousness. But when a sighted person sees and engages with an external form, then there is stimulation of that section of the consciousness. So the material form, which has thus come to be, is included in the material form aggregate affected by clinging. The feeling and what has thus come to be is included in the feeling aggregate affected by clinging. The perception and what has thus come to be included in the perception aggregate is affected by clinging. The mental formations and what has come to be are included in the mental formations aggregate affected by clinging. The consciousness in what has thus come to be is included in the consciousness aggregate affected by clinging. So basically it's just saying that the stimulus affects the material form, feeling, perception, mental formations and consciousness, i.e. the five aggregates. So, continues Sariputta, he understands that these things are included, gathered and amassed into five aggregates affected by clinging. And so Buddha has said, Sariputta quotes, a person who sees dependent origination sees the Dhamma. Someone who sees the Dhamma sees dependent origination. And these five aggregates affected by clinging are dependently arisen. The desire, indulgence, inclination and holding based on the five aggregates affected by clinging is the origin of suffering, or, as I said previously, discontent. The whole discussion about sight and its effect on the five aggregates is then repeated in for the other sense organs. So it's repeated for the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body and the mind. And also reiterated for each sense contact is the statement, the removal of desire and lust, the abandonment of desire and lust for these five aggregates affected by clinging is the cessation of suffering. That is as expressed in the Four Noble Truths. At that point, continues Sariputta, much has been achieved by the monk. That's the end of Majjhima Nikaya Sutta number 28. Thanks for watching.